Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 24, The Long 7th Century, Part 5, The Inquisition. Last time, Eckhart Fromm took us through Ashurbanipal's monumental reign, the foreign policy debacles he fumbled, and we briefly touched on the downfall of Assyria in the decades after the last great Assyrian king's death. In the Book of Kings, though, Assyria's destruction is hardly a footnote, as it occurs in the reign of the king's author's favorite of all Judahite kings, Josiah. Josiah, in King's telling, is everything. He's the ideal which every past, present, and future king is measured against, and after his death in 609 BCE, the kingdom of Judah faced constant turmoil, with kings being replaced by other kings, a decade of juggling between the emergent Neo-Babylonians, and a resurgent player on the scene, Egypt.
So, Patty, tell me more about your trip to Egypt.
Nothing more to tell, really. The Nile smells like cattle rot, and they've got horseflies over there the size of your head.
Marvelous. Just marvelous.
The Egyptians had been supported as a vassal by Assyria, and under Pharaoh Psamtik I, they took advantage of Assyria's decline to assert autonomy. The formerly well-heeled subject state quickly became Assyria's force to be reckoned with in their own right. Unfortunately, the end of Assyria means that we start to run out of primary sources to utilize after Nineveh's downfall. This is the kind of thing that happens when states decline. Many of the works used to reconstruct this period were written retrospectively, with the Babylonians seeing themselves as the triumphant and righteous inheritors of Assyria, and the biblical authors try to sort out what went wrong according to their own motivations. But at the same time, we'll also see, for the first time, an explicit reference in the Book of Kings to something called the Book of the Law, the book, in other words, of Torah. While other sources for this period, which the author calls the books of the Annals of the Kings of Judah or the books of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, have been lost to time, this supposedly rediscovered book, found during Josiah's time, might very well have been the basis for part of the Torah itself. Whatever the source of this work, the last great king of Judah will be said to use it as inciting propaganda to engage in a campaign of cult reform that might resemble something more like the Spanish Inquisition. Because of the chaos of this period, I've split this episode into two parts. To help us get through the mess, I've also brought back the wonderful Dr. Kipp Davis, our resident Dead Sea Scrolls specialist, who has an exciting new book that would make a great companion for this show.
What's kind of the broad kind of argument or theme of the book that you're making?
So the broad argument of the theme is that the Bible is awesome in the first place, but that people just don't understand it as well as I think they should in a way that helps them to discover why it's awesome. So as you can, in the title, God's Propaganda, pulling back the curtain on what the Bible wants you to see, a running theme throughout my book is just how much we miss when we read a lot of these texts and what they have to say about the religious world and the history of this entity, or these entities we know as the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So what does the text have to say about them, and why does it have to say things about them, and how do we put these things more appropriately in their first written context, and then against the backdrop of the actual religious landscape and historical landscape of ancient Israel and ancient Judah, and then how these texts were appropriated into, the scriptures that we now have them today. Each individual chapter in the book is kind of a stand on its own lecture from my Israelite religions course. So, the first 4 chapters are basically background stuff like geography, family institutions, texts. I've got a whole chapter in there, just a survey of ancient Near Eastern literature. And then I've got another chapter on how to situate the Hebrew Bible within this ancient Near Eastern literary milieu, right? And then, the next section, I've got texts on who the gods were. Yeah. How does Yahweh fit into this? 2 chapters, each dedicated entirely to the 2 creation stories, which are probably among my favorite. And then I've got chapters about, national identity. Who is an Israelite, and how did they understand this term, and how did they appropriate this? How does the national epic of the Exodus fit into this story? Then I've got chapters about, kingship and the royal line. I've got a whole chapter, the largest chapter, also among one of my favorites in the book, is all about the succession narrative of King David. And I treat it very seriously. A lot of scholars, a lot of people will just tell you that David just didn't exist, right? Like, this is just a legendary figure. We don't know, right? Certainly the David, as he's portrayed in, Samuel and Kings, didn't exist. But I like to play with this idea of, what an historical David might have looked like sitting behind the text. And it is it's really interesting, trying to tease out what the text says about this guy, and the goings on of maybe the early stages of not a united kingdom, but I think maybe a Judean kingdom in the very beginning, a thing we know virtually nothing about, right?
Yeah.
So, and then I wrote an article, the last chapter in the book, which I've titled "The Empire of the Walking Dead."
Oh, cool.
Is my chapter devoted to apocalypticism and apocalyptic literature. And I wrote a number of years ago an article for the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture called "Zombies in America and at Qumran: AMC's The Walking Dead and Apocalyptic Redux," in which I basically explored themes that come forth in. I wrote this back in 2000. I want to say 2013, 2014, might have been 2015, but basically right at the end of season 5 or season 6 of The Walking Dead, for those who remember it on TV, back when it was still good, right? And I explored basically in this article themes that come forth in this television show and how closely they map onto things that you read in Jewish apocalyptic literature, in particular in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and made the case that zombie apocalypticism, the zombie cinematic genre and the literary genre, in many respects is like a modern day 21st century, very dark apocalyptic worldview, but helps us, I think, to understand apocalypticism in early Judaism. And I think early Judaism helps us I think they work really well for informing each other. So I've
Right.
basically rewritten the article and
cool.
incorporated it into a new chapter at the end of the book that I'm pretty excited about.
I'll bring in pretty lengthy clips throughout the episode and the next, and the full wide-ranging interview with Kipp, which clocks in at over 2.5 hours, will be available for Patreon subscribers a few days after this episode hits the public feed. A fair bit of warning, I won't say I blew it with this interview, but I did step on Kipp's lines a bit and kept sidetracking the conversation. I was a bit overeager to nerd out about this stuff, so to Kipp and all listeners, I beg forgiveness for some of the digressions. Today's main sources are the Oxford History of the Ancient Near East, Volumes 4 and 5, Eckhart Fromm's Assyria, and a variety of others. As always, these and all other sources will be listed in the episode description. And of course, make sure to support the show in order to get early access to episodes and hours of bonus content at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. I've also set up a bookshop.org affiliate link where you can support the show as well through buying some of the books I've recommended in the past, which is also listed below the episode. When we last left Jerusalem, Manasseh had cleaned the place up a bit over his half-century reign. He'd become a decent friend to the Assyrians, but his son and successor, Ammon, if Kings is to be believed, did something to piss off someone and ended up getting himself killed. In the aftermath of this mysterious coup, his young son Josiah is given the keys to the kingdom. Kipp and I had a great discussion about the historical background to Josiah's reign and the political situation he found himself in upon his ascension to the throne as a child.
So this is at a point where Assyria is becoming more destabilized. There's a lot of internal stuff happening back in Nineveh. It takes their focus off of the reaches of this empire that they put together, which is already kind of unwieldy in the first place.
Yeah.
And is becoming just increasingly more difficult to control.
Yeah, they finally got Egypt, and it was kind of
Yeah.
like, they're the dog that caught the car. It's like
That's
you
exactly
you
right.
finally got this huge piece of land.
Uh-huh.
And so it just spreads them so thin.
Yes.
They've
And
got
Egypt takes advantage of
bureaucrats
that too,
in like
right?
Memphis, like, they've got all these outposts that they need to get from like Gaza to through the Sinai.
Yeah.
Like they have to control. The Nile Delta is not a small place for an empire at the time to manage.
No. And this ultimately does backfire on them. Egypt is able to kind of throw off that vassalage right around this time. And when Josiah is installed as a monarch, it's kind of in this period of Assyrian decline in the region, Egyptian assertion. They're becoming more prominent, and little Judah, little Jerusalem is sort of stuck in the middle here. And this is why there tends to be so much conflict and turmoil throughout the region, just basically from the time. I mean, this is already a contested region, all the way back into the Bronze Age, right? The Hittites and the Egyptians are constantly in competition with one another for control of this very important land bridge that basically connects Assyria and Babylon and Anatolia to the north to Egypt in the south. And the reason for that is because you've got basically this 100-kilometer strip of land, arable land, between the coast and the Transjordan on the other side. And then beyond the Transjordan is just 800, 900, 1,000 kilometers of trackless wasteland that is completely impassable.
Basically, you have Arab traders throughout the time that use camels, but that's not practical for moving entire armies and supplies, and that will remain kind of this no-go zone that creates this de facto importance of these roads that lead through. I mean, they didn't used to lead through Jerusalem, and I don't know that they necessarily are super critical on the trade route, as opposed to like Megiddo, which we'll get into later.
Right.
That ends up being to the west a bit more of a serious choke point, where so many battles take place in that region throughout history, frankly. And that's kind of, it is fascinating because, like, do we know anything about Josiah's relationship in the early period? So he rules from the 740s to 709.
Editor's note, don't listen to that guy. It's the 640s to 609.
This period over these decades is, Ashurbanipal, the last decades of his reign. And then we kind of know a little bit about what happens. Do we know what his relations were like with these foreign powers, with Egypt and with Assyria?
We know very little. We know almost nothing outside of what the biblical text tells us of Josiah. And there's of course there are scholars who will promote ideas that all of this is just fiction. I don't think that's any fun. So I tend to push more towards a historicized reading of a lot of this literature. So we know only what the Bible has to tell us, and what we can reconstruct from a lot of the archaeology, which I don't know nearly as well from the period, but it looks like the vassalage is still in place with Assyria, even though it's significantly weakened,
right,
and getting increasingly weaker. I think Josiah, and he's a young man. If the Bible is correct, he's maybe just a kid,
which would make sense
if
his. I mean, I trust that the king's lists are broadly
pretty stable,
stable, even if they can't always tell us about ages and stuff. The fact that his father only rules for a couple of years, that does
seems
lend
like
credence that he was I don't know if he was specifically 8 years old, but he was a young man, sort of like Manasseh, his grandfather was when he took the throne.
Yeah, exactly. And I think young men in that sort of a position are shaped very deeply, very, very sharply by their advisors and their teachers and those who are helping them grow into these roles, right? Probably much more so than figures who have the opportunity to grow up and enter adulthood.
Right. You can form your own opinions on your teachers and on your advisors
Yes.
before you actually take over, which isn't always the most stable thing, frankly. Sometimes these kind of young kings actually do pretty well. Josiah's is kind of interesting, though, because there may be something to the way that like I don't think I tend to explore the Bible and history a little bit separately, particularly in Kings, just because of how much stuff it gets pretty blatantly wrong or is very clearly propagandizing. But there is this immediately after his introduction as a king, it goes in 2 Kings 22 right into this very fascinating and probably one of the most crucial passages in the biblical text. So can you tell us a little bit about what happens there?
Yeah. So if I could just by way of a little snapshot of background, because I think this is important too. The way I tend to read this period from Hezekiah to Josiah, and this is oversimplified, but I think this is what the writer is grappling with, is the ways in which these crucial rulers, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Ammon, less so, but still in there,
and Josiah. I mean, they are the main three. Everyone else is, as Francesca.
Well, I mean, minus Ammon, but yes.
Everyone else is kind of downplayed in significance. The theological argument of the entire Bible, which was picked up way back in Ahab and Jeroboam's time near the start of the Northern Kingdom, because it reaches its climax with these three kings especially.
Yes. And I think what you see are very fuzzy reflections of an historical reality of what was actually going on politically, economically, internationally in the region, and the ways in which the Deuteronomist is presenting each of these figures. I like to think of Hezekiah in the first place as someone who became convinced, even though he as you noted, he arrived in a pretty good situation. With relative to what had happened with the Northern Kingdom,
the apex of Judah. Frankly, the 7th century, as good as Manasseh does, he can't, because Assyria has parceled a lot of the land out and given it, which is something the Bible mentions and that Assyrian records confirm. Sennacherib gives a lot of that land to loyal vassals, to his friends, to manage as regional governors. And so there is something there which is fascinating in that he's this very pious king, and yet frankly his miscalculation was a significant one.
Yes, it was probably in my opinion, it was, and it's interesting the way the Bible handles this. It was probably one of the biggest mistakes from a policy perspective that's recorded in the text. And I think he was encouraged by some of the things that he was seeing taking place within the Assyrian administration. Maybe he saw a chink in the armor there.
Everyone was rebelling.
And and I think what you see happening is a connection of this policy to this emerging idea coming out of the temple that is reflected in some of in particular, I think in some of the prophetic oracles of Isaiah, of first Isaiah, who was probably also serving as a trusted court advisor in some capacity. I think he was really pushed on in this idea that we don't need anyone's help, that we can go out alone. We can do this by ourselves, because that's just the kind of guy, that's just the kind of God Yahweh is. Yahweh doesn't need to play nice with other gods. So we can just say fuck them. And we're going with Yahweh. It's just us and Yahweh, ride or die, titty mobsters, and that's how we're gonna do things. And as we all know, that did not work.
No.
So, and as a result, Hezekiah's very good position suddenly became much more restricted.
But there's an interesting kind of consequence of this, which is, I think, where
what do you think?
I also see something in the Bible. I think it's really fuzzy, but it is something that Dan talks about, Dan McClellan talks about sometimes, which is that the reduction of the state of Judah, the reduction of the boundaries, and the fact that every single bit of this kingdom was basically picked clean by Assyria of its riches, and their cult sites were destroyed, and all of this buildup that Hezekiah had done militarily was reduced to ash, except for Jerusalem. And so if there were these advisors, if these oracles do go back to Isaiah about the inviolability of Jerusalem, those gain some, even though it's under circumstances that are not ideal, they do gain purchase, and you can see those people be able to
in
say
the text itself.
Weirdly, I told you so, even though I probably would not take it that way.
Exactly.
But there is this idea, and so that's where I almost feel like maybe there's something to those people. I don't think they were a significant force in the broader kingdom, but the idea that some of them may have, especially in Josiah's time, looked back at Manasseh, despite him being extremely successful, and said, no, things were better when we were the only cultic site for that brief period of whatever a decade.
This is I think that's very close to how I read the history here too. And what I see in Hezekiah's, when Hezekiah is succeeded by a very young Manasseh, who also is probably heavily reliant on an advisory who's helping him navigate this situation, and it's a difficult situation, but based on what we know of him, and I think you can read between the lines of the biblical text to see this, he seems to have quite a talent for diplomacy, for accommodation, for making for surviving, and basically reconstruction in the face of what was a pretty devastating blow to Hezekiah's kingdom.
Oh yeah.
So and in that respect, the way I read Manasseh and read between the lines of Manasseh, here's a guy who's saying, I have to do things differently than my father did. I can't listen to these same people. I've got to play nice with Assyria. I have to set my focus on restoring as many of these cooperative relationships as I can.
Right.
This all tends to get read by the Deuteronomist as, I for lack of a better word, this is all just the idolatry of Manasseh, the accommodation of other gods, the taking on of alliances that include foreign marriages. This is all stuff that the Deuteronomist looks down on,
which is really fascinating, because I think part of me suspects that, again, this is conjecture, since all of this is basically conjecture, since the Deuteronomist I find to be a very untrustworthy source. But the fact that we don't really know when Hezekiah died, his death is probably one of the more disputed dates for these late kings. It's anywhere from 695, I think, or even earlier I've seen, to about 687. And what's interesting is he didn't cause another stink. I mean, he couldn't, But I do wonder if in those early years, if he was likewise cowed by Assyria and was totally willing to kind of play ball and play nice. And that's kind of where I'm like, I think Manasseh, I don't know that Manasseh necessarily learned this from other people besides his father. I think his father got his shit rocked and may have, to some extent, realized like, okay, that was a big,
that didn't work.
That didn't work.
Maybe, eh?
And so that's where I'm almost
interesting.
I struggle to, without any other evidence, see what Manasseh is doing as necessarily out of step with the last years of his father's reign. Because you see potentially with Josiah what happens when someone is pot committed to this idea in a more perhaps extreme way. Now, I don't think Josiah, we'll get to this, but I don't think Josiah fucks up as bad as Hezekiah does. I think Josiah is put into a much harder position, and I think the same thing about a little bit about some of his successors. Less so, because what are you doing rebelling?
Yeah,
what are you doing rebelling against Babylonia? But that's kind of my own pet theory of like, if we're going to be speculating, if Hezekiah did reign for a few years, who's to say that there is just as much, there is no evidence necessarily that he wasn't a good and loyal vassal. In fact, Sennacherib's inscriptions seem to state the opposite, that he was a very, very helpful vassal afterwards who was very apologetic for his fuck-ups. And that's where I guess as we get past Manasseh, that is my only kind of tempering of your reconstruction, is not to derail you a bit, but I wanted to give you some food for thought there.
No, that's good, and I think that works too. It makes intuitive sense as well when you are as humbled as badly as Hezekiah was. Yeah, maybe some of those court prophets lost their jobs ahead of time. But but this is sort of the world into which Josiah enters, and I think the coup, it's unfortunate we know nothing about it, but I think the coup is probably an important feature for understanding what happened next. Clearly, there were members of the aristocracy in Jerusalem who were unhappy with the way in which Ammon was doing things, and they installed Josiah as essentially an instrument to get things done their way.
2 Kings 22 says he was just 8 years old when he took the throne, and the author keeps it short and sweet when summarizing his reign up top. Quote, "He did what was right in the sight of Yahweh, and walked in all the way of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left." But these pleasantries are almost modest in their brevity, as the author goes on to detail through deed just how astonishing Josiah's reign was. Back to my conversation with Kipp.
Josiah becomes king. He is crafted by these advisors and cultic figures who are probably often the same people, bureaucrats and kind of the central Jerusalem authorities, and they shape him into the king they want to some extent. What's the big kind of climax of that?
So maybe I'll just read, because I've so I have set this into a bit of a creative retelling.
Sure,
I guess you could say it. Here's something of what I think this looks like. This is a chapter that I've written in my book about the God Yahweh, who he is, how people thought of him, how he fits within Canaanite culture and history. So, and I start with the Song of Moses. The Song of Moses is widely regarded among scholars as one of the oldest individual texts of Israelite literature. It's preserved in Deuteronomy 32. There's a parenthetical comment that appears just before the song in 31:30, setting it historically at the time of the Exodus in the Bronze Age. Then Moses spoke in the ears of the whole congregation of Israel the words of this song all the way to the end. As old as the song is believed to be, it was never spoken by Moses. There's no word on why he chose not to sing it either. No, the book of Deuteronomy itself is thought to have been written much later, during the reign of Josiah, the king in Jerusalem, in the mid 7th century BCE. We first learn about Deuteronomy from the programmatic narrative briefly introduced earlier in the book in chapter 4, the national epic that is appropriately known by scholars as the Deuteronomistic history. The Deuteronomistic history appears in the biblical books Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and it is so called because of how closely its historical program reflects the theology of the book of Deuteronomy. Moreover, as noted in an earlier chapter, the Deuteronomistic history lionizes this king, Josiah, and the earliest form of this work probably ended with a very positive appraisal of his dramatic religious reforms. So this story tells of good King Josiah's efforts to renovate the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem, presumably long neglected by his father Amon and his grandfather, the detestable King Manasseh, who, quote, committed more evil than what the Amorites did who were before him. That's 2 Kings chapter 21:10. When Josiah asks for an audit of the temple holdings to fund his project, the high priest, Hilkiah, announces that he has found the book of the Torah in the house of Yahweh. That's 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 8. The book is brought to the king and read to him by his own scribe, Shaphan. I'll just pause here and say it's very interesting that several of these figures are key players as well in another book of the Bible, and that's in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is very fond of the king Josiah, said to have lived as a young man while Josiah was still the king in Jerusalem. But Jeremiah is also said to be the son of a priest by the name of Hilkiah. And one of his benefactors is a scribe by the name of Shaphan, or part of this scribal family, an important scribal family at this time, the scribal family of Shaphan. So the scribe reads the book. The contents are jarring. Upon hearing it, the king is extremely distraught and sends for a prophet to help him understand the implications of this ominous document. Go make inquiries of Yahweh on my behalf, also for the sake of the people and all of Judah concerning the words of this book that was found. How great must be Yahweh's wrath that has been kindled against us because our fathers did not hear about the words of this book to do what was written in it. So that's 2 Kings 22, verse 13. A woman, prophet named Huldah, who is connected either to the temple or to the king's court, is found in her home by the king's retinue, and she responds to Josiah's great alarm with this. So says Yahweh, the God of Israel, say to the man who sent you to me, so says Yahweh, I am about to bring a disaster to this place and its inhabitants. All the words of the book which the king of Judah has read, because they abandoned me and offered sacrifices to other gods. So I have been provoked to anger by the doings of their hands, and by my fury, and my fury has been kindled against this place. It will not be quenched. So that's verses 16 and 17. So after hearing this grave proclamation of doom, Josiah responds with a comprehensive and ruthless campaign, according to the text, to eliminate all forms of observance to the gods, and instead attempts to centralize all sacrifices and rituals to Yahweh alone, and only, very importantly, only in the Jerusalem temple. It's a bold move. Within this cultural climate in which the many gods were always there, always enmeshed in the outworkings of nature and life, it could not have been an easy proposition. Sure enough, even the naked propaganda of the Deuteronomist preserves an echo of the brutality that must have accompanied Josiah's draconian mandate. Chapter 23, verse 20 says he sacrificed all the priests of the Bamot, the high places, who were there. He burned human bones upon the altars. So that's kind of the way this looks when Josiah, at some point a little later, we're told in his reign, decides that he wants to do some renovations in and around the Acropolis of the temple itself. So he goes to find out how much money is there in the temple holdings in order to undertake this project. And the high priest returns to him and says, well, we have some funds, but more importantly, I found this book. Literally the book of the Torah is what the text tells us, the book of the law. This is part of a lot of what I find tantalizing and mysterious all in this story as well, is we're not told what the contents of the book were.
They never quote from it.
Never. All we get is this oracle from Huldah. Now, I tend to fall in line with some scholars. Lundbaum, what's his first name? I can't think of it
Lundbaum?
now.
Lundbaum. Jack Lundbaum?
That's the one. Jack Lundbaum. I tend to fall in line a little bit with Jack Lundbaum, that the way in which she responds with her oracle, you can map some of these words pretty directly onto the contents of the Song of Moses itself in Deuteronomy 32. He's posited, and I think he's probably right, that on the basis of the antiquity of this text, this was probably something like what was at the heart of whatever it was that was presented to Josiah.
And this gets to the heart of why this hectic period is so important to understanding the origins of the biblical texts. Josiah's temple administration is said to have found a book. For centuries now, scholars have noted the ideological and theological connections between Josiah's reign, as described in Kings, and the book of Deuteronomy, the final book of the Torah. Josiah is said to centralize all worship in Jerusalem. More on that in a minute. And Deuteronomy focuses on correct worship at this one specific site. There are many hypotheses for the specifics of how this all worked, of what was contained in this hypothesized early version of Deuteronomy, which likely would have been shorter than the final product. Usually that's how this kind of textual production works. You start with something smaller, and it grows over time, like Gilgamesh, if you'll remember. As I noted in our Esarhaddon episode, there are specific influences visible between his oath treaty and the book of Deuteronomy, the contents of its curses and blessings, and the order they're laid out in. Some scholars, like Jeffrey Stackert, posit that an earlier version of the text could have been composed during the reign of Hezekiah, one that rewrote some of the older contents of the covenant code found in Exodus, which was then revised and expanded by Josiah for his specific campaign. I'll link his video in the episode description as well. So we can see the law code segments that revise these earlier laws. We have the influence of Esarhaddon's treaty text, placing this text firmly in a 7th century context. And now we have the forced centralization of all worship to Jerusalem as one of the most important parts of Deuteronomy. Whatever form Deuteronomy was in at the time, it had a lot of influence on many of the works that came after it over the centuries. It presages the conquest narrative of Joshua that we went over in my first episode with Kipp, as the Israelites are commanded to quote-unquote cleanse the land, something they repeatedly failed to do, leading to the book of Judges, which portrays the Israelites as leaderless and in disarray, which gives way to the books of Samuel and Kings, recounting the conquest of Jerusalem and the formation and struggles of the Israelite and Judahite monarchies, all culminating in this moment, where Josiah is said to finally carry out the command to read Moses' law and centralize all worship in Jerusalem. Deuteronomy, in other words, is the idealized text around which much of the first 9 books of the Hebrew Bible pivots, and the way this theology is said to be deployed in Kings by Josiah is a horror show I went into detail with Kipp about.
And there's all sorts of ideas with regards to the development of this particular very important critical text within the Bible. There's a substantial component of it that's this legal code, which is rewriting and recontextualizing a lot of earlier material that you find in the covenant code in the book of Exodus. And importantly, a lot of the cultic renovation, the cultic redaction that's taking place in this law code has to do with these really, really important features that you then see reflected in the story of Josiah's reforms, which the Deuteronomist wants us to think are reflective of his policies, his religious policies, which then I also take in view of some of his international policy as well. A couple of things of real importance to the Deuteronomist are this: Josiah gets rid of all the high places where all the gods are worshipped. So that's basically just tearing apart and destroying these shrines in the city of Jerusalem, in the region surrounding the city that he controls. All of this stuff, we're told, was destroyed. And as I mentioned, if any of this text is to be believed, if there are things within this text that we do take seriously, and I do, this must have not been an easy or a peaceful undertaking. One of these texts, it comes through. English translators don't like this verse at all. This verse in chapter 23, verse 20, which I translated quite literally.
So this part, just to give a little bit of context, this is where it gets a little bit spicy, because it first says that he tears down the high places within Judah. He starts to take down, he starts to commit his, you could call it Inquisition, I think is the term you used our first time. And this is really interesting because there are some things that I think are pretty fucked up in there. I think he burns bones on them, on some of the sites. However, in 23, it goes beyond that, and he actually starts campaigning into the north, past the reaches of the kingdom of Judah, into Bethel and Dan, the former places that are now technically at that time part of the Assyrian province of I think it's called Samarina in Assyrian terms. And so that's one of the more fascinating kind of questions and that's where things, especially, I guess, to let you get back to it, get bloody rather than merely cultically offensive.
Yes. And that's where I think you start to see the lines converge between his religious policy and his international policy, right? And you're right. Like, so his campaign begins in Jerusalem, in the temple specifically, and most of the text is dedicated to describing this this basic emptying of the temple of Jerusalem. We're told that he clears out any of the cultic paraphernalia in the temple that might be deemed offensive to Yahweh. There's other figurines,
I think,
almost certainly within the temple.
Asherah is probably the only one who's gods. Mentioned by name of the gods. Yes. I think the term importantly is used as host of heaven is more broad, which is interesting, because as we've seen before, some of the mentions of Asherah throughout the book of Kings are pretty clearly later emendations, and I don't know if I've seen anyone theorize that this one could be, but that is an interesting idea to me. But anyway,
the hosts of heaven.
No, I mean the Asherah portions are sometimes, like when you think about the prophets of Baal versus prophets of Yahweh, and then the author inserts in, and also some prophets of Asherah there too, and or priests, and that's kind of where I'm like, I'm a bit intrigued by that she gets, this is where she truly starts getting very specifically polemicized against.
Yes.
And this is one of the few places, if I remember right, where it doesn't merely refer to her cultic object, or at least the way that some scholars interpreted it, as only referring to the cultic object. I know our friend Chrissy Hansen has pointed out that it is also referring to the goddess. I mean, but in this case, she is named in a more specific manner, as being in a very kind of using we'll say proper nouns, if that, however that works in Hebrew.
Yeah, that's probably I would agree with that. Just in terms of the geography here, it starts in Jerusalem. A lot of space dedicated to the cleansing of the temple, to clearing it all out and getting it set and ready, just as the exclusive space of Yahweh. It extends into Jerusalem, then into Judah, and as you point out, ends up with this fairly bloody campaign into the north, which, as we talked about last time, I think we have reason to think about juxtaposing some of the stuff we see in the conquest narratives in this same sort of a context of, expansion and purging, and in particular in the northern region beyond the actual borders of Judah proper at this time. One of the things that I like to point out in connection with the Asher in particular, in chapter 23 is where it begins. The king ordered the priest, again Hilkiah, the priests of the second rank and the guards of the threshold, to bring out of the temple of Yahweh all the objects made for Baal and Asherah. So specifically, this is what you're getting at. This isn't just the Asherah pole, the object. These are objects dedicated as well to her specifically, and all the host of heaven. That's Sabah Hashemayim. It's the same root. It's the same word basically that's used with a specification of Yahweh with great frequency throughout the prophets, especially. This is Yahweh Tsabaot, Yahweh of the hosts, or Yahweh of armies. These are understood always to be like a
divine military,
a cosmic military. Yeah. Literally, these are the stars of the heavens, right?
Yeah.
The Kokavim that you see in the sky were understood by these people to just be the forces of the gods on the ready, to do their bidding. But anyways, so that happens. And then it says he burned them all outside of Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and he removed the ashes to Bethel. He suppressed the idolatrous priests with whom the kings of Judah had appointed to make offerings at the shrines in the towns of Judah and in the environs of Jerusalem, and those who made offerings to Baal, to the sun and the moon and the constellations, all the host of heaven. Then it says this: he brought out the Asherah from the house of Yahweh to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem, and he burned it in the Kidron Valley, and then he pulverized it to dust. And then I find this particularly interesting. He scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. That's the Am Ha'aretz, the people of the land, who also make appearances in the book of Jeremiah, and then again in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah.
This is interesting because it's typically translated as the people, the common people. Who is in view here?
So here's who I think is in view here. And I tend to read this against the backdrop again of some of the things that you see appearing in the book of Jeremiah, and on the basis of a lot of what archaeologists have been writing about for the last 20 years with regards to the cultic environment of Jerusalem and the surrounding Judean highlands in the late 7th century. What we see from the archaeological record is not a lot of prominent Yahweh worship. What we see in the archaeological record, specifically in just the houses of the people who live in the area. These are the farmers in the villages, but you see it as well in places in the city. There's not a lot of places in Jerusalem where you can dig down far enough to see some of this stuff, but in places in the city as well, where you can find this kind of material. This is what it suggests, is that the Asherah was just an immensely popular figure of worship within the broader Canaanite pantheon. As we understand the reconstruction from the material culture, William Deaver wrote a really nice book about this a number of years back. A very accessible book
Did God Have a
called
Wife?
Did God Have a Wife? Yeah. Where he makes a very strong case and a nice accessible case, like I said, for general readers, that the people by and large away from the Acropolis in particular, not necessarily those of the aristocrats. They
didn't need
these are
house
like
gods. They had the real deal in the temple.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, but in your houses, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You're worshiping Asherah.
You've got a shrine, and you have the different. You probably, if you were wealthy, you'd probably have, or at least decently well off, you might have multiple gods in your household shrine.
Yeah.
And so Josiah is portrayed as a king who brought an Inquisition not only into Judah's households and important cultic sites, but also into the Assyrian province of Samaria. And this campaign into the north doesn't seem terribly improbable, because while all this is happening in Judah, Assyria was slowly torn apart as a political entity and taken over by the Babylonians. Josiah may have very well viewed himself as a competitor to the Babylonians under their new king, Nabonidus. But unlike the conquests of Egypt and the Medes, it's hard to just destroy the home city of an empire and have it disappear. You can't just cut the head off the snake. Assyria was not just the king. Empires are defined in part by their vast infrastructure, not just roads and aqueducts, but networks of people and economic interests and messaging capabilities and influence. People who can coordinate, fund counterattacks, advise retreats, replace leadership who have fallen in battle, crown a new king, those kinds of things. The corporeal emperor is never the whole empire, no matter how much he might present himself as such. And so to finally kill and replace Assyria, it took a decade-plus long war that presaged other politically transformative and drawn-out conflicts, like the 30 Years' War or the Napoleonic Wars or the World Wars of the 20th century. Sometimes political systems recover from these crises, like the English kicking out Cromwell or the Bourbon Restoration in 19th century France. But Assyria was one of the ones that didn't make it back. It was swept into the dustbin of history. In 612 BCE, in the middle of this chaos, Nineveh was destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians and Elamites. Elam's hatred of Assyria is very easy to explain. Assyria had destroyed other Iranian groups like the Medes, and Elam had, within a few decades, come to fill their place in the political situation to the east. The Babylonians, on the other hand, were comprised of a collection of Mesopotamian tribes primarily from southern Iraq, loosely connected by Aramaean and Chaldean heritage, and led by a former high-level Assyrian administrator, Nabonidus. Nabonidus had the job of someone like Simon Bolivar in South America or Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, uniting diverse local groups into a force to be reckoned with, a force that could depose an empire. The diversity of these southern Mesopotamian groups will remain a challenge after Babylon wins the war, so make sure to bookmark that in the back of your mind. So Nabonidus and the Elamites united and made pretty quick work of Nineveh when they finally got there. The city had so many gates, which demonstrated its impressive status, but this sprawl ended up being part of its weakness, and the siege was basically a foregone conclusion. You have so many different entry points to this city, you cannot practically guard them all. Maybe the ball game was already called for Assyria at this point. It's hard to say there was any hope, but it still took years afterward to see the final destruction through. And in this troubled time period, the few years between Nineveh's destruction and the last gasps of the Assyrian rump state at Haran, Jerusalem was rejoicing. It seemed Isaiah's oracle that I mentioned in the second child sacrifice episode was coming true. The Assyrian dynasty was on the altar in the Tophet, and the divine priest's knife was raised. Soon an offering would be made. There's a book in the Bible dedicated almost exclusively to celebrating the coming destruction of Nineveh, the writings assigned to the contemporary prophet Nahum. He's one of those prophets that people might forget when they're trying to list all the books of the Bible. It's sort of an obscure book, and it stands out as an oddity among many of the other works that castigate the audience for not being pious enough towards Yahweh. Not so with Nahum, who simply rejoices at Assyria's destruction. Quote from the beginning of the book. A pronouncement on Nineveh, the book of the prophecy of Nahum the Elkoshite. Even this title marks it as a bit strange. This beginning of Nahum is essentially two different superscriptions, one marking it as a book of prophecy tied to a specific guy called Nahum, and the first, which is simply a pronouncement on Nineveh. It's pretty laser focused on dunking on the Assyrian crown. Continuing. A jealous and vengeful God is Yahweh. Vengeful, Yahweh and master of wrath. Yahweh is avenged of his foes and bears a grudge against his enemies. Yahweh is slow to anger and great in power. But Yahweh surely does not acquit. In tempest and whirlwind his way, and a cloud is the dust at his feet. He rebukes the sea, and it dries up, and all rivers he turns to dry land. And so once it gets going, the poetry starts with pronouncements that should be pretty familiar to anyone who's been listening to the show for a while. Yahweh is an angry god, he gets revenge, he kills, and he can even defeat Yam, the sea, an important marker for anyone who wants to contend with Baal and Marduk as similar sea-taming deities. It's tough to know if this book was actually written just before Nineveh was destroyed, as it seems to present itself, but there is an Iron Age detail that makes me think that the author was, at the very least, pretty familiar with the recent history. It comes in chapter 3, near the very end of the book. Quote, Nineveh has been ravaged. Who will console her? Where shall I look for anyone to comfort you? Were you any better than Noamon, which sat by the Nile, surrounded by water, its rampart a river, its wall consisting of sea? Noamon here is the name for Thebes, the ancient Egyptian capital, which you'll recall was sacked by Esarhaddon and reconquered by Ashurbanipal around a half-century before our present moment. The author is noting that Nineveh is about to share the same fate as that city. Continuing, populous Nubia and teeming Egypt, Put and the Libyans, they were her helpers. Yet even she was exiled, she went into captivity. Her babes, too, were dashed in pieces at every street corner. Lots were cast for her honored men, and all her nobles were bound in chains. You too shall be drunk and utterly overcome. You too shall seek a refuge from the enemy. So probably not the kind of passage you're going to hear repeated in a contemporary church, unless your pastor is either really awful or perhaps really cool.
No, not God bless America, God damn America, that's in the Bible.
Putting the content of these verses aside, I think the relevance of the destruction of Thebes and its relation to Assyria and their downfall lends a bit of credence to the idea that even if the original author's works were revised and edited over time, and even if it wasn't written by a guy called Nahum, the author of this work was familiar enough with the details of the 7th century to get a few core things right and not commit any anachronisms, at least none that I'm aware of. As we get further from this period, authors writing about it tend to get a lot of things wrong, out of order, attributed incorrectly, and so on. Ctesias, a Greek historian writing in the 4th century, considers Ashurbanipal, who he calls Sardanapalus, the last king of Assyria, even though we've seen he clearly wasn't. Details about the king's death and its significance were added on, forming the legendary figure of Sardanapalus. And this is what we see with parts of the Bible, like the book of Daniel, that are likewise written centuries after their purported events. They tend to get things wrong. They have some larger moral to the story that they want to convey, and so the authors either knowingly or unknowingly conflate people and assemble a faulty timeline based on incorrect information. Camels show up in Genesis before they were domesticated and present in the Levant. Legends about Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, are ascribed to Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. Just like Ctesias, these authors were telling their stories using the methodologies and existing legends of the time. They didn't have Oxford's History of the Ancient Near East series to fact-check their works. And yet Nahum, without those kinds of advantages, seems to be written by someone familiar with the events, so it's not implausible that it was written either when it's set, near the fall of Nineveh, or within a few decades after, before legends had overtaken the memory of the reality on the ground. Once again, we find more evidence that some of these texts have their roots in looking back on this particular century. Some of it may have started at this time, including Nahum. The vindictive joy felt by the Judahites at the coming destruction of Assyria is palpable in his pronouncements against Nineveh. Quote, "And Nineveh in time past was like a pool of water, but now they flee. Stop, stop, but none turns round. Loot the silver, loot the gold, and there is no end to the hoard. Treasure of every precious vessel. stripped and distraught and despoiled, fainting heart and buckling knees, and shuddering in all loins, and all faces lose their luster. Where now is the den of the lions, the cave of the king of beasts? There the lion walked, the maned beast there, the lion's cub with none to make them tremble, the lion tearing prey for its cubs and breaking necks for his lioness. He filled his lair with prey, and his den with torn apart flesh. Here am I against you, said Yahweh of armies. I will burn up your chariots in smoke, and your maned beasts the sword shall devour, and I will cut off from the earth your prey, nor shall the sound of your envoys be heard again. But Nahum's celebration was a premature end-zone dance. The violence was not yet at an end. Josiah, the king who may have commissioned Deuteronomy to be written, who was at least said to have engaged in mass violence in service of centering all worship in Jerusalem, who is even said to have celebrated the first Passover since the time of Joshua, a hero modeled after him, is about to make a mistake that would do his great-grandfather Hezekiah proud, as he miscalculates the current geopolitical situation and suffers immediate consequences. We'll explore just how Josiah blew it, what the immediate fallout was, and will finally give Assyria its deserved farewell, all on the next episode of the Bible Lore Podcast. Special thanks to Kipp Davis, who you'll hear more from next time, and thanks again to all of my Patreon subscribers for supporting the show. Make sure to check out patreon.com/Bible Lore Podcast to join the ranks, and I will see you next time.